In 1991, after generations in the making, Major League Baseball finally granted an expansion franchise to the city of Denver, Colorado. This team, known as the Colorado Rockies, began play in '93 and spent their first couple seasons cohabitating with the NFL's Denver Broncos. In '95, they moved into their very own brand new ballpark, Coors Field. Situated a mile above sea level, the dry, thin air there is extraordinarily conducive to baseball soaring, uncontrollably and constantly, when whacked by a swinging bat. To call the sprawling ballpark hitter-friendly would be like calling water wet or Antarctica cold. This is well known to baseball fans far and wide, but despite being keenly aware of all that, when I decided to chart my own deep dive into the numbers, it still surpassed my wildest expectations. This video is presented by T-Mobile. Let's start with a quick look at that inaugural Coors campaign of '95. Based on slugging percentage, or total bases per at-bat, the Rockies were the third worst hitting team on the road. Yet despite what for the other 27 teams is an awfully strong positive correlation between road performance and home performance, the Rocks used Coors as a launching pad to post a home slugging of .556, not just the best home slugging in the bigs that season, with no one else even within 70 points of them, but no team had ever come within even 25 points of such a high number. And while isolating road performance and home performance are each two completely independent, mutually exclusive datasets, the outlier of home slugging is so strong that it lifts their overall slugging as high as number 2 in MLB. Really think about that for a sec. The road sample, of which they're third worst, constitutes half of the overall sample, so there's extreme overlap baked in there, and yet they're still somehow able to overcome to that degree the extreme road gravitational force dragging them down. But even the strike-shortened '95 will prove to be a mere appetizer to the next year. In Coors' very first full season, it cranked up the dial even more, way more. Thanks to the lack of normalized, uniform ballparks, one could reasonably argue that a pure way to assess the level of a team's hitting proficiency is isolating just their 81 road games, thus rendering moot any inherent advantage or disadvantage provided by their home park. Well, in '96, the Rockies weren't just dead last in road slugging, there was a cavernous 17-point gulf separating them from the next worst Expos. By no means is it any sort of be-all end-all, but one could thus reasonably argue that, in finishing that much worse than anyone else in road slugging, the Rockies employed the worst collection of bats in the bigs in '96. And yet Coors took that same collection of bats and gave them a slugging so high that by far the worst road slugging team was transformed into the third best overall slugging team. And as a member of the National League, they didn't even get the benefit of utilizing a designated hitter, a benefit bestowed upon the only other teams in their range. Among fellow NL clubs who had to send a pitcher to the plate in lieu of a DH, no one else is within 40 points of them despite that atrocious road performance. This compels more of a light being shined on their '96 home performance. With a slugging of .579 across those 81 games, it's by far the highest figure on record, about 50 points higher than any non-Coors dwelling team. For perspective, through the first 15 years of Mike Trout's career, his slugging was .570. Coors Field turned their lineup of road ineptitude into 9 Mike Trout clones and then some. .579 beats by over 20 points the career sluggings of a few other guys you may have heard of: Stan Musial, Mickey Mantle, Willie Mays, Frank Thomas, and Hank Aaron. Even when narrowed down to a single year, plenty of longtime great sluggers, even in their very best season, fell shy of such a lofty mark. And here are even more ways to contextualize it. That manifested in their 4 fearless leaders, Ellis Burks, Andres Galarraga, Dante Bichette, and Vinny Castilla, all recording over 215 total bases at home, which is gobsmacking. Here you can see that every MLB team combined in the 29 years from 1941 to '69 combined had 0 such players. Same story spanning the 15 years from 1980 through '94 before Bichette did so the prior season. And yet just the Rockies, just in '96, had 4 such players. The guy who was 4th on the team in home total bases still produced a total barely ever seen across the preceding half-century. And no other big leaguer that season except Mo Vaughn racked up as many as 190 total bases at home. I'm also partial to their RBI totals. Here you can see from 1951 to 95, there wasn't a single instance of a big leaguer driving in as many as 90 runs at home, before all of a sudden in 96, not one but 2 guys on the same team drove in not just 90 but 99 plus runs at home. Then across the subsequent 29 years and counting, not a single instance of anyone topping 91. Perhaps you're curious how this translated to team runs scored. I got you covered. Their 303 runs away from Coors have them comfortably ensconced in dead last for road scoring, but at home they more than double that with more than 50 runs left over to boot. It amounts to over 8.1 runs per game, just jaw-dropping stuff. Combined with the more than 6.9 runs per game their opposition scored, a fan attending an average game at Coors Field in 96 could expect to see more than 15 runs scored. As a brief aside, on top of their quartet of home destroyers, the 96 Rockies actually had a 5th bat that, on a rate basis, was even more destructive within the confines of Coors: Larry Walker. He missed close to half the season, so his volume isn't up there with those other guys, but I prefer to focus on the fact that missing nearly half the season means he played in over half the season. Yet even in that sizable a sample, he married a historically high home slugging of 800 with a truly pitiful road slugging of 307. Taking a look at that delta, no one with comparable playing time in a season has ever even come close to such a discrepancy. 96 Larry Walker was the ultimate Coors Field merchant. The very next season, the Gold Glove right fielder rode one of the very greatest all-around seasons of all time to a runaway MVP campaign. In my opinion, the best way to frame Walker's 97 season is through a historical lens of big leaguers with the most total bases plus stolen bases in a season, of which he had an astounding 442. For decades beforehand, basically no one came close. For decades afterward, basically no one came close. Thus, one might figure that this occurred as a natural byproduct of playing at Coors. Yet, in an M. Night Shyamalan-esque twist, that inexplicably couldn't be further from the truth. The very same Larry Walker who was the ultimate Coors merchant in 96 happened to hit 9 more dingers and slug 24 points higher on the road than at home in 97. So don't ever let anyone impugn Walker's MVP or dismiss it as a function of playing his home games at Coors. In reality, it's completely Coors-proof. Let's go ahead and stay in Funland for just a bit longer by looping in the following 5 seasons on top of Coors' first 2 for a snapshot of its first 7 seasons before we'll get to a noteworthy inflection point in 2002. I've narrowed down from 1 million to 6 some charts that I think most comically capture the essence of Coors Field during this era of 1995 through 2001. They had a home road total base delta north of 3,300 with said homer delta north of 350. Here is how the other 29 teams stack up. If we swap in runs for home runs, similar story. 29 squads who each individually display at least a resemblance to being on the same page as to production at home versus on the road. Then the Rockies, in a northeastern galaxy light years away, not even reading out of the same book. Here's a glance at total bases on a per game basis. Even across a sample as lengthy as 7 years, look at that home performance just jumping off the charts, combined with the remarkable serendipity that they just so happen to be dead last on the road. But that home performance still allowed them to take the overall elevator to the very top, even above every DH-wielding club, which comprised spots 2 through 10. Gotta drop down to the D-backs all the way down here to find the closest NL challenger. Same story with runs per game. 7 years worth of being dead last on the road, yet at north of 7.1 runs per, not just MLB's best mark at home, but the best by a margin of over a run and a third, and more than 2 runs better than the NL runner-up. Overall, they still managed to pull off a silver medal with 5.64 runs per game, less than a tenth of a run behind Cleveland, a gap which would be overcome and then some had the Rockies likewise been blessed with a DH, and a number good enough to top any fellow NL squad by nearly a half run. After those 7 years of zaniness, we reached that aforementioned inflection point. In 2002, to combat the arid atmosphere at Coors in an effort to make offensive numbers less eye-popping, the Rockies installed a climate-controlled humidor chamber to keep baseballs stored in a damp environment. This prevents them from otherwise drying out and shrinking in the low humidity, basically simulating their original storage warehouse. That can be reflected here with Homer deltas. We can revel in the pre-humidor days in which they've got 4 of the 6 all-time most lopsided discrepancies. Within the window of 1995 to 2000, while they hit at least 63 more dingers at home than on the road in 4 of those 6 seasons, no other team in that period had a single campaign in which that surplus exceeded 35. Since 2002, however, while the Rockies still have by and large gotten a bigger home field homer boost than anyone else, you can see how it's at least come down to earth a bit. But while that mitigation applies to homers, Coors' thin air and massive outfield still prove too much for even the humidor to overcome in any significant manner when it comes to metrics like slugging percentage, its volume-based cousin total bases, and runs scored. Here is a look at slugging deltas. The Rockies own 10 of the 12 highest single-season figures, and one of the 2 exceptions hails from the massively abbreviated 2020 campaign, and the other occurred during the Hoover administration. So for all intents and purposes, they've got each of the 10 highest in the last 90 plus years, and 5 of those 10 are post-humidor. Total bases is even more amusing, virtually immune to the humidor's effect, which barely makes any dent at all. They've got 11 of the top 12 and 20 of the top 26 all-time single-season discrepancies, and remember, Coors only existed without a humidor for 7 seasons. Also, all 6 non-Coors seasons in the top 26 occurred decades before it was even built. In fact, going all the way back to 1956, there have been 20 instances of a team having a season with at least 300 more total bases at home than on the road. And all 20 belong to the Rockies. If you're interested in that discrepancy in percentage form, they've got a similar stranglehold. Excluding strike or COVID-marred truncated campaigns, they've got each of the 18 highest full-season rates of the last 50-plus years, and each of the 12 highest full-season rates of the last 90-plus years. Coors' humidor is also ultimately pretty powerless at curbing home inflation as to runs scored. The Rockies are owners of 10 of the top 11 and 20 of the top 26 such home road discrepancies, with that also turning into a perfect 20 for 20 in the 70-plus years since 1956. And percentage-wise, they've got each of the 9 highest full-season rates of all time, 4 of which occurred post-humidor. Last but not least, throughout the first 31 years of Coors Field's existence, it was one of 69 different ballparks that hosted at least one MLB contest. In that time, Coors played host to 82 games wherein both teams scored at least 10 runs, more than triple that of any other venue except Globe Life Park, which it still more than doubles. Granted, many teams have their totals split across multiple home stadiums in this time, but even accounting for that barely changes the calculus. The next most such home games anyone played during this period is the Rangers at 38, and likewise that's the only team they haven't tripled in that regard. I can even isolate a stretch in '99 of less than a month where 6 such shootouts occurred at Coors. Juxtapose that against New Busch Stadium, which in the 18 entire seasons from 2008 through 2025 combined, played host to 0. So while there's nothing quite like the cartoonish offensive boost provided by Coors throughout its 7-year pre-humidor run, its presence in the decades since its O2 installation diminished that boost only slightly. Really, it underscores just how mighty a force Coors remains, still flexing its muscles atop its mile-high throne, turning batter after batter into royalty. Thank you all so much for watching and supporting Secret Base. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you want to get access to even more and see your name included alongside all these other distinguished folks, subscribe to Secret Base on Patreon.